Jonathan, thank you for that introduction, and thanks to Arit for inviting me, and for all of you for making me feel so welcome over the last couple of days. I had not been involved with the work of this organization until I came to Berlin, and I'm a convert.
Thank you, since we have witnesses here.
So I'm going home to proselytize. So like many of you, I have a day job, as Jonathan's suggested, in addition to my dedication to Jewish causes. And for my day job, I'm an internet and privacy lawyer, leading the global practice at Hogan Lovells. And since the earliest days of the internet, I've tried to use my professional knowledge to fight online hate speech, especially anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, as well as racism, homophobia, and all forms of internet hate speech. So it pains me that a remarkable tool for communication, for education, and for entertainment has been perverted to advance the lies of hatred. And I've been doing what I can for the last 16 or 17 years to help address this scourge. The last time I was in Berlin was a few years ago, and I was here for a meeting of the International Network Against Cyber Hate, which is known as ENOC, which I then chaired. ENOC's a collaboration of NGOs from around the world that work together to combat online hate speech, including Holocaust denial. And a member of ENOC is the Anti-Defamation League, whose task force on internet hate speech I founded in 1995 and continue to lead. And at the ENOC meeting, we gathered not far from here in the so-called New Synagogue on Orienberger Strasse in the Mitte. And the synagogue, as you probably know, is one of the handful that still stand, a handful of buildings that still stand. And before the Shoah, I'm told there were more than 80 synagogues here in Berlin. And there was obviously great symbolism in meeting there in one of the few remaining synagogue buildings, just a few miles from Wannsee, where several of you went the other day, and where in 1942, senior Nazi officials met to plan the final solution to what they blandly called the Jewish question. The extermination of the Jews of Europe. And given where we were, the screenshots that we saw, similar to what we saw here the other day, of dozens of internet sites denying the Holocaust ever happened, were especially chilling to watch. I remember the November weather in Berlin that year was cold and wet, much as it is today. And I arrived back in my hotel in the evening really feeling raw, both physically and emotionally. So only a few years have passed since that Berlin gathering, but much has changed on the internet. Facebook was just underway when we met here for the ENOC meeting. Today, it has 800 million users and is projected to enroll its 1 billionth user sometime next year. Last month, I was in London for a meeting of the task force that Jonathan mentioned. It's the Task Force on Internet Hate created by the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism, known as ICCA. And it was there that I again saw how much the internet has changed in just a few years, how many more outlets there are for people to engage in Holocaust denial, including Facebook, and how big a problem online hate has become. The ICCA task force includes members of parliament from around the world, internet experts, scholars, and representatives of internet companies. And as was mentioned, my co-chair is Julie Edelstein, Israel's Minister of Public Affairs and the Diaspora. And I should note that both Facebook and Google have chosen to participate in the work of the task force, which I view as an extremely positive sign. And it's an indication of the awareness of those companies of the problem and a sign of their commitment to do more than they have been. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So in London, the ICCA task force met in a hearing room in the Houses of Parliament on the nature and extent of internet hate today. And at the London hearing, we saw the same kind of Holocaust denial that we saw here and that we saw at the ENOC gathering in Berlin a few years ago. But we also saw how Holocaust denial has infiltrated social media where users can generate content and post it to the internet, and everyone can be a publisher with global reach. So from YouTube videos, we saw some the other day, we saw there some YouTube videos such as the one posted by Ernst Zundel and entitled "The Holocaust Debunked," to Holocaust denial groups on Facebook. We saw vividly how Holocaust denial has embraced what's known as Web 2.0 and the tools of social media. There are even Twitter accounts used to promote the vicious and hateful lies of Holocaust denial. And beyond that, we saw how legitimate news sites, sites operated by online newspapers that permit people to post comments on news stories, also have been found to contain the rantings of anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. And the instances of online hate are, I'm sorry to tell you, growing geometrically through these online tools that permit people to post to the internet. So it's much, much more than simply the websites of Zundel or Tobin. The number of websites, online videos, Facebook postings by its 800 million users, and blog entries is staggering. And of course, with mobile devices to access the always-on internet, Holocaust denial is just a click away on a device in your pocket. Hate on the internet has become commonplace, even ordinary. And I commented at the ICCA hearing on how during the Nazi era, the routine appearance of anti-Semitic expressions made them commonplace and even ordinary to the citizens of Germany who stood by when the seeds of the Holocaust were sown. And today, to a new generation, online hate, including Holocaust denial, is also a routine appearance. Now, thankfully, there are messages online containing counter-speech and setting the record straight, and we heard about education efforts such as that at Yad Vashem. And many of the people exposed to the lies view them through the filter of education that they've received that teaches the lessons of the Holocaust. And that's probably one of the most effective tools. But the Holocaust denial propaganda continues with unknown effect. Or rather, I should say, we can never measure the true effects of online Holocaust denial. You might recall that in 2009, a notorious Holocaust denier, a neo-Nazi white supremacist named James Van Brun, who maintained a Holocaust denial website, who was 88 years old, by the way, and who was egged on by fellow online haters to keep his rage alive, he stormed the Holocaust Museum in Washington and shot to death a museum guard named Stephen Johns. Now, we'll never know what exactly what role the internet exactly played in provoking Van Brun to go on his rampage at the Holocaust Museum that day. But we do know that the internet was a tool that he and his fellow Holocaust deniers used to communicate, to recruit, and to provoke. And remember, in the pre-internet era, people like that met down dark alleys and used plain brown wrappers to distribute their hate-filled lies. And beyond the potential of the Holocaust, the internet Holocaust denial to misinform, beyond its potential to recruit and incite Holocaust deniers and to allow them to collaborate, it's simply the mere appearance of Holocaust denial on the internet is disgusting to civilized people, and to survivors is a vicious affront. So with that background, I want to tell you that I stand before you as a very conflicted lawyer. You know, it's my job, it's our job as lawyers to find legal solutions to problems. That's what we do. But much as I'm inclined to say, as many here have done over the last couple of days, there ought to be a law when we see Holocaust denial. I know and have found through my years of study about this that the law, sadly, is largely an impotent tool against the geometric growth of Holocaust denial on the internet. The sheer scale of the internet and the literally millions of places where Holocaust denial can and does appear makes policing content and bringing sufficient prosecutions to make a difference impossible. Moreover, as we heard this morning, evading Holocaust denial laws is a relatively easy thing for people to do on the internet. To be very frank, in countries that have adopted speech codes prohibiting Holocaust denial, the effects of those laws have been only marginal with respect to online Holocaust denial. On the Enoch listserv that I subscribe to, this is the NGO of groups fighting internet hate, there are routine celebrations of successful convictions of Holocaust deniers in Europe. but they number in the dozens every year. That's dozens from an internet with billions of users. So at best, the prosecutions, in my view, are only symbolic. Yes, some notorious and outrageous websites have been eliminated, but the prosecutions do not address or affect as a deterrent the growth of online hate speech, especially the more insidious forms of Holocaust denial, such as passing comments on a news site that the Holocaust never happened, Facebook postings, and Twitter feeds, the kind of denial that treats that treats the non-existence of the Holocaust as a given. And the more people see it, the more they accept it as a given. And for that, isolated prosecutions do nothing. I liken it to kitchen counter cockroaches. Smashing one in one place does nothing to stop their appearance elsewhere, and we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, on the internet, millions behind the wall. And remember, the internet allows a great deal of speech to be broadcast anonymously, so identification for prosecution often is impossible. We heard that this morning. And even where the identification and conviction results, convictions frequently turn the targets into martyrs of their like-minded haters for their benighted causes, prompting even more attention to their lies and tribute sites to them, spreading their Holocaust denials even further than they might otherwise go. We talked this morning about Frederick Tobin, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because we did not hear a very important coda to the story of his prosecution. Yes, he was prosecuted in 1999, but the Germans again tried to prosecute him in 2008 for his online postings. But he was in the UK at the time. He got the message that he shouldn't come to Germany for his vacations. And he escaped extradition. There was a question about extradition. He escaped extradition from the UK to Germany because of legal technicalities under UK law having to do with the difference in speech codes in the UK and in Germany. And that episode brought more attention to Tobin's website and to his hate speech far beyond what his publicity efforts could have produced on his own. A little bit of the Oscar Wilde syndrome, and prompted sympathy sites from neo-Nazi sympathizers around the world. Germany eventually gave up on its efforts to extradite Tobin in 2008. I also want to say a word about the Yahoo case that Monsieur Levy spoke about yesterday. He did quote accurately from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Jose, California, but he left out the punchline, which was that the court said there could not be a ruling about the French judgment because it wasn't ripe. The French hadn't come to the United States to enforce the judgment. And the Ninth Circuit did nothing to disturb the rationale of the lower court that said, under our First Amendment, enforcing the French law in the United States is impossible. So I'm here to tell you, as I think you can surmise by now, that the reflexive use of the law as the tool of first resort to deal with online hate speech threatens to weaken respect for the law and obedience to the law if the attempted law enforcement fails, as it often does, or is used against minor violations. Indeed, in the welcoming letter that we received for this conference from the German Minister of Justice, she wrote that, quote, criminal law prohibitions can only constitute a last resort in this area, and I agree with that. Now, it must be noted also that, and this was mentioned this morning, that cross-border prosecutions give support to repressive regimes like China to request international support and assistance in enforcing their speech codes, which they justify as just as important as Holocaust denial laws, but which in fact are squelching the voices of dissidents. Jonathan, you suggested this morning that perhaps the government should fine Google and Yahoo for the appearance of hate speech, but drawing the line as to what constitutes hate speech will be extremely difficult and may ultimately end up in the elimination of a lot of speech that we want to see. Still, I recognize that the laws against Holocaust denial can serve to express a decent society's outrage against speech that goes well beyond the pale of what is acceptable in normal discourse, especially in light of recent history. The European Union's framework decision on racism and xenophobia states that denying or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide should be made punishable in all EU member states. Likewise, the undersubscribed hate speech protocol to the Cybercrime Treaty is to like effect. And in countries like Germany and Austria, The enforcement of laws against Holocaust deniers, given the bitterly sad history in these places, serves as a message to all citizens, especially impressionable children, that it is literally unspeakable to deny the Holocaust given the horrors of genocide inflicted in these countries. So I'm not saying that the law has no role to play in fighting online hate speech, far from it. I am saying that countries with speech codes should make sure that the proper discretion is employed to use those laws against internet hate speech, lest the enforcement be seen as ineffectual, resulting in a diminished respect for and compliance with the law. And I am saying especially that the realities of the internet are such that censoring online content through legal means in one country is far from a guarantee that that content is shuttered for all time. And that largely is because of the legal framework in my country. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution establishes freedom of expression and protects virtually all speech, even the most repugnant, including Holocaust denial. And the law may only be used if hate speech causes an imminent threat of violence or interferes directly with the individual's legal rights, a specific threat against a specific person. Unlike in many countries, as we've heard several times at this conference, there is no human right to be free from the indignity of hate speech that can be balanced against another individual's right to free expression. So I think it's fair to say that as a result, the U.S. is a de facto haven for hate speech, essentially free from the strictures of the law, and internet content in the United States can be broadcast everywhere around the world. And that's not going to change. I'm not apologizing for that situation, but nor do I have any ability, nor does anybody have any ability to change this. I was at an OSCE meeting in Paris not so long ago, and a former French Minister of Justice literally yelled at me from the audience, "Stop hiding behind the First Amendment." I'm not hiding behind the First Amendment. I'm simply stating a reality of the internet. And I should also note that the big internet companies who broadcast to the world, intermediaries like Google, from whom we heard the other night, and Facebook, they can, in fact, choose to edit content from their services under their own First Amendment rights. And they can and sometimes do decide that content that cannot be subjected to legal regulation under the First Amendment may nevertheless be declared by them to be out of bounds because they want a service that is civilized and that does not espouse hate. Often their terms of service say so much. Facebook and YouTube, for example, don't permit nudity. And online services frequently have services to prohibit hate speech. And at the Anti-Defamation League, we regularly monitor the internet and bring hate content to their providers so that they can take action. But the editorial discretion of internet companies in enforcing their terms of service is colored by the First Amendment in the country where their companies are based. And we have found that except where it's absolutely clear to them that the speech is inappropriate, they err on the side of publication rather than restricting content. You know, as we've heard, Facebook allows Holocaust denial sites. They just don't get it that Holocaust denial is, per se, hate speech, and we're working on them. And I and others have tried to tell them that, and hopefully with them sitting at the table in our meetings of the ICCA task force, the message will get through. Similarly, earlier this year, there was a third intifada group established on Facebook. And we objected at the ADL, Minister Edelstein objected, and the initial decision at Facebook was let the flow of ideas happen, and then we explained to them the only flow of ideas is for violence against citizens of Israel. And that's something that's prohibited by the terms of service. And Facebook finally took down the third intifada group when they saw that all of the content was exactly as we predicted. Hate-filled invective to inspire people to commit acts of crime in Israel. There was even a third intifada app available through the Apple iPhone store. Apple immediately took that down when we brought that to their attention. I do want to provide a brief addendum to the discussion yesterday of Jew Watch on Google. You remember that discussion where if you search for the word Jew, one of the top search results was Jew Watch, and the speaker left it at that. What's important to note is that the ADL went to Google and said that should not appear as a top search result. And Google says, as they do in these cases, the computer did it, our algorithm did it. And we don't tamper with results because if we start doing that with you, we have to start doing that with everyone else. And we were at a stalemate until we suggested, then why don't you put a border around that search result that tells people this is hate speech and that you don't support it. And that's exactly what they did. And if you go online, put the word Jew in, see Jew Watch come up, and I did that sitting in the back of the room here, so it even occurs in Germany, you'll see a sponsored ad. The search results below are offensive. Read more about anti-Semitism, and they have a full page on anti-Semitism with a link to the Anti-Defamation League. And it's that kind of cooperation that we hope to get more of. So when the ICCA task force meets again, which will be next May at Stanford University's Center for Internet and Society in Palo Alto, we will have at the table Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Twitter and others. And we will be focusing on the way that those services can do more to come forward and more than they have. And again, I think having them participate is an extremely positive step. By the way, shortly before I came to Berlin, ADL's National Director Abe Foxman gave a very compelling speech at the ADL National Commission meeting in New York City for greater involvement of internet companies to combat hate speech. You can find that online, and you'll see that it's quite powerful. Now, of course, US-based companies make efforts to comply with local speech codes outside the US, but even where compliance is attempted, again, the sheer volume of user postings makes compliance very difficult to achieve. So even with an issue as complex as hate speech, using technological filters, remember there's 60 hours of video posted to YouTube every minute, so they can't have a human being watch. I'm in good shape on time, I think. So I think it's unrealistic to expect human review of every postings. You know, you may know that Google's executives, including a friend of mine from Paris, were convicted in Italy for not preventing the posting of a YouTube video of a disabled child being harassed, which violated Italian law, and for not removing it as quickly as officials would have liked, although it was voluntarily removed by the company. And that conviction that's currently on appeal is roundly derided as one that simply ignores the realities of the internet. But still, ENOC, the ADL, and the ICCA task force, we all call upon the internet intermediaries to enforce their terms of service against hate speech and to work harder, as they must, to understand what qualifies as hate speech, and in particular to pull down Holocaust denial content. We do that not under color of law, but we do it in a call for moral and social responsibility. And that dialogue will continue. So to conclude my remarks, I want to mention that in connection with this meeting, I had a conversation with my friend Deborah Lipstadt, who is well known to this group. And she is perhaps the most accomplished practitioner of counter-speech against Holocaust denial that I know, given her victory over David Irving in his libel suit against her for labeling him a Holocaust denier. So I asked Deborah about her position on the issue of using law to deal with Holocaust denial, specifically criminalizing Holocaust denial, given her 6-year legal battle to which David Irving subjected her. And I expected, even though she is American, that she might be a strong proponent for such laws in light of the fact that David Irving's rantings caused her incredible time and expense, both emotional and financial. But her response to me was, in classic Deborah fashion, "Have you read my book?" And I had, and that meant the book about the Irving trial, and I didn't remember her position on this point. So I went back and reread it and other writings, and I see that she's a big believer in free speech in this area. And in fact, in a piece for the Washington Post, she said, I want to quote her, "So why not silence Irving and his compatriots? First of all, I believe in free speech. In the United States, the First Amendment guarantees people a right to make total fools of themselves. Sometimes it is painful to hear, but I would rather they had the freedom to say what they wish than the government had the power to control them." And she went on to say, "Furthermore, I do not believe that laws against denial are strategically wise. They tend to make martyrs of the accused, arousing sympathy for them. They also render the item which has been outlawed forbidden fruit. Thus, it becomes more enticing and appealing to certain segments of society, disaffected youth, for example." And she then wrote about counterspeech and said this, "More importantly, genocide denial law suggests that we don't have the facts and the documentation to prove that these people are liars. We defeated David Irving in court not with the law, but with the facts. We followed his footnotes and demonstrated, in the words of Professor Richard Evans, that Irving's work on the Holocaust was a tissue of lies. Our Defeat of Irving is a far more powerful commentary on his work because it is rooted in the facts and did not occur under the cover of a general law outlawing Holocaust denial. And so, with her characteristic wit, she concluded, "I shudder at the thought that politicians might be given the power to legislate history. They can hardly fix the potholes in our streets. How can we expect them to decide what is the proper version of history?" So I will give Deborah the last word, but I will sum up by saying that I, like everyone here, am thoroughly disgusted by the common appearance of a Holocaust denial online in websites of notorious deniers, but also in incidental comments appended to news stories or YouTube videos. Last time in Berlin, I was chilled and deeply saddened by what I saw online at the synagogue on Orienberger Strasse, and in the ensuing years, the situation has gotten worse. Holocaust denial takes on a life of its own in the modern internet, but I have concluded that the realities of the internet are such that effectively policing on Holocaust denial through law is unachievable due to the scale and scope of the internet and also due to the US First Amendment. In my work to fight internet hate speech, I advocate counter-speech and education and more frequent voluntary takedowns where possible by internet intermediaries. These tools, in the end, have the potential to be far more effective, I think, than the law in combating online Holocaust denial. Odd as it is for me as a lawyer to say the law is a last resort, but that's where I come out on this subject. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you.